Welcome back to the Astro-Insights Podcast. In episode 1 of this series, we looked at Neptune's ingress into Aries and what it could mean for the arts, for psychology, for spirituality and cultural beliefs, and how the Saturn-Neptune cycle figured into all of this, particularly when it comes to things like finance and politics. In this episode, we continue the thread by looking specifically at the astrology of Saturn's ingress into Aries, which will happen this May. Given all the recent turmoil in world markets, I thought it might also be useful to look at Saturn's role in global financial cycles, specifically its 20-year boom and bust cycle with Jupiter. We'll also get into the separate but related phenomenon known as the Grand Mutation and what we can potentially learn from previous instances of Saturn-Jupiter grand conjunctions, because there are some really interesting historical parallels that I think are worth looking at. So as I mentioned last time, Aries represents spring and the start of the natural life cycle. And as the first sign of the zodiac, Aries is all about birth, new beginnings, and the innocence of youth. In psychological terms, it represents the individual personality or ego identity, singular, self-confident, and set apart from the herd. Aries is also a cardinal fire sign and Mars ruled, though, which means that it has an active, masculine, dynamic quality to it. Aries likes to initiate, explore, and is unafraid of taking risks. In Jungian terms, we might describe the zodiac sign as a combination of the warrior and the Puer archetypes. Courageous, independent, and pioneering, but also potentially foolhardy, destructive, and immature. But there's no getting away from the fact that both are decidedly masculine kind of planets and signs. So I suspect that for the most part, this particular ingress is going to influence men and male-oriented topics more strongly, including things like the defense industry. After all, Mars is the god of war, and Saturn, with its emphasis on boundaries and limits, can represent defenses, similar to a castle wall, for example. So given what I was saying about Neptune's recent ingress into Aries and how this seems to link to previous periods of imperialism and wars, it seems fitting, especially in light of what happened last month to Ukraine and the shockwaves that it sent to the NATO alliance. But getting back to psychology, I find it interesting that both the Puer and the Warrior archetypes have had a major hand in shaping the Western cultural mindset. Both reflect patriarchal values and ideals like heroism, bravery, physical strength, and rugged individualism, and both are found within a range of Western art forms, mythical narratives, and ideologies, from the Arthurian legends and other classical heroic epics to the Crusades, and more recently, neoliberalism. Think survival of the fittest, market competition, success through individual effort, and an entrepreneurial spirit that moves fast and breaks things, and doesn't like regulation or restriction, and tends to poo-poo what it perceives to be kind of weak or kind of girly, in inverted commas, notions like state intervention or social cooperation, and you'll see what I mean. Now, in marked contrast to this is Saturn, which in many respects represents the other end of the masculine spectrum, mature manhood and the wisdom of old age. This is the wise leader and teacher who shows the value of circumspection, consistency, and persistence through difficulties. Someone who welcomes rather than rejects the role of laws and limits in staving off chaos, and who sees the value of tradition and established institutions in stabilizing society and preserving knowledge or achievements for posterity. And this, of course, is where the Saturn-Jupiter cycles and their correlation with world markets comes into the picture. Now, Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions are an interesting phenomenon. In ancient times, these two planets were known as the Great Chronocrators, because for millennia, their alignment coincided with significant social, economic, and political watersheds, historical turning points, if you like. In his book, Mundane Astrology, Charles Harvey writes, these two planets used to be known as the two chronocrators or rulers of the ages. Their cycle can be considered the ground base of human development, which marks the interaction between the perception of ideas, potentialities, and possibilities, which is, of course, associated with Jupiter, and their manifestation in the concrete material world, which is Saturn. So their conjunctions were also thought to herald the birth of great prophets and messiah figures. For instance, many astrologers believe that the Star of Bethlehem, which alerted the wise men to the birth of Jesus, was probably the triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in Pisces, which took place in around 7 BCE. so around the time that he would have been born. And this was thought to be especially true during periods when the conjunction shifts elements, and a phenomenon that astrologers call a grand mutation, more on which a little bit later. Now, in modern times, of course, the 20-year cycles have become associated with a number of social trends. The boom and bust cycles of the stock market, the birth of our cultural icons like John Lennon and Princess Diana, and according to Marjorie Orr, the cycle is also rather strangely associated with the assassination or death in office of several US presidents. I invite you to read her book, The Astrological History of the World, if you want to know more about this particular phenomenon. But anyway, back to the Jupiter-Saturn cycles in the world of finance. Now, Jupiter and Saturn are the two social planets, but like Saturn and Mars, are polar opposites in many respects. So on the one hand, Jupiter is the great benefic, a planet associated with luck, growth, expansion, and idealism, and so tends to have a positive influence on the markets. So it tends to do things like increase consumer or investor confidence, as well as give people faith in the viability of certain shares or companies, and it tends to foster an optimistic financial outlook, as well as, during good times, a nice fat portfolio. Saturn, on the other hand, is traditionally seen as the harbinger of doom, the great malefic that results in market crashes, as bubbles burst and inflated valuations or product hype come crashing down to earth with a bump. So, in a lot of ways, this is the planet of financial prudence. Careful planning, long-term investments, saving, and a focus more on tangible assets like real estate rather than the somewhat more ethereal types of investments like derivatives. So generally the combination of the two, especially at conjunctions, has the potential to help investors cultivate balanced outlooks and manage risk so that they only take calculated punts and look at investing on a medium to long-term horizon instead of getting sucked into a hype cycle or, say, a meme stock phase. However, during the course of their waxing and waning aspect phases, their shifting relationship over the course of 2 decades tends to mirror the natural fluctuations and changing fortunes of world markets, especially Wall Street. Now, we had a recent reset of this cycle at the winter solstice of 2020, when Jupiter and Saturn made a conjunction in the sign of Aquarius. And this was significant for a number of reasons. Not only did it coincide with the end of the COVID pandemic, which for astrologers was set in motion by the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, but it also marked the start of a bull market, particularly in tech stocks and crypto, even if this was prematurely cut short by the Saturn-Uranus squares of February and December 2021. But that's a story for another time. More importantly, though, what was significant about this particular conjunction was that it was also the first time in over 180 years that the conjunction took place in an air sign. So up until that point, all the previous conjunctions, bar that of 1981, had been in earth signs, which is why the 2020 event was referred to by astrologers as the Grand Conjunction, because it symbolized what I was talking about earlier, a grand mutation, where the elements switch. So, this conjunction moves from Earth to air signs. So, as I was saying earlier, grand mutations often mark historical inflection points, particularly in terms of things like world affairs. In a future podcast, I hope to take a closer look at previous instances of this phenomenon, particularly the grand conjunction of 1623 and the one that preceded it, the Grand Mutation of 1603, which was witnessed and written about by Johannes Kepler, but there isn't really time for that now. Turning to the present cycle, I think it's fair to say that the conjunction of December 2020 certainly brought about a kind of a type of optimism. It was the end of COVID. Joe Biden had just been elected to the White House. There was definitely a sense of kind of optimism in the air. But somehow, like we've moved on from those heady early days, and we've now moved to the quarter moon stage of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which is symbolized usually by a series of squares or 90-degree angles. So these happened quite recently. The first was in August 2024. The second was on Christmas Eve 2024, so December 24th. And then there's another one that's still coming up, which is on the 15th of June 2025. Now, these squares often tend to represent a test of faith. And that's certainly how many people have been feeling about what's happening, particularly since the election of Trump in November 2024. Given that we've still got this one last pass to go, plus the recent fluctuations in the stock market created by Trump's tariff policies, which of course happened also in conjunction with the Aries solar eclipse, and that one was particularly associated with shocks and sort of like dramatic natural disasters and that kind of thing. I think it's worth returning to what happened during the previous boom-bust financial cycle of 2000 as a way of kind of orienting ourselves and perhaps trying to work out what we can expect this time around. So returning to the previous Jupiter-Saturn cycle, this conjunction took place in the spring of 2000 in the sign of Taurus the Bull, a good sign, you'd think, for markets. Sadly, however, as is sometimes the case with Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, high hopes or inflated ambitions have a way of coming crashing down to Earth. And this is what happened in the autumn of 2000 with the dot-com crash, which ended the bull market fueled by speculation in tech stocks and internet startups that started in the 1990s and essentially came to a halt as Saturn popped the Jupiter-inspired tech bubble, leading to a market reset, as sometimes happens during the new moon phase. So despite this conjunction in late May, the Nasdaq and Wall Street stocks rallied on the back of Jupiter's move into air sign Gemini. And for a few months, many analysts thought that the market would recover. However, this all changed when Saturn, the party pooper, came back on the scene, ingressing into Gemini in July 2000, just before the August summer break, which is traditionally quite it means the markets tend to be quite quiet. What finally killed off any hope of a rally, however, was a set of challenging aspects to Jupiter and Saturn from some of the malefic outer planets, including Uranus and Pluto. Thus, in September 2000, the market finally turned, and the rest, as I say, is history. Plus, of course, we have to consider that we had the 9/11 terrorist attacks the following year, which also decimated the travel industry, and that's very in keeping with Saturn as a kind of a downer touring through Gemini, which is often associated with things like telecommunications, but also with travel. So during the bear market, the Nasdaq index, which had risen 800% between 1995 and 2000, tumbled approximately 77% from its record high in March to an all-time low in October 2002. So by the end of 2001, most dot-com stocks had gone bust. So for as well as mirroring the sequence of events associated with previous tech-inspired booms, including the railroads of the 1840s, automobiles in the early 20th century, radios in the 1920s, and television in the 1940s, the dot-com crash was also significant for another reason, which is related to our earlier discussion of the Grand Mutation. For financial astrologer Christine Skinner, the writing was definitely on the wall for the status quo back in 2000. For her, the final Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Earth signs signified a slow shift away from safe haven investments like bonds and tangible assets like real estate towards non-tangible assets like shares, complex debt instruments such as derivatives, which interestingly were introduced during the anomalous 1981 conjunction in air signs, as well as things like digital tokens. Certainly digital tokens like crypto, for example, which were first introduced in 2009, would also fit this bill. However, they are arguably more a marked feature of the latest Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which is Aquarius ruled, which kind of coincided with the, as I say, the start of the Bitcoin bull market, when we saw large investors like MicroStrategy and other financial services and investment companies begin to get in on the action. So I'll kind of leave that aside for the moment. But I think back to the 2000 cycle, back then the predominant form that the shift in asset class took was tech stocks, especially the so-called Magnificent Seven, many of which came to Wall Street's attention post-2010 with the rise of Silicon Valley, when they became some of the highest performing and influential stocks in the world, their IPOs making many of their founders and CEOs overnight billionaires. Now, Yanis Varouvakis has termed this new form of wealth creation command capital, which he defines as prosperity generated via the financialization of digital assets like tech stocks or digital services, which are, and this is the key thing, valued not in terms of company profits, but in terms of share price valuation. So in the main, we've come to associate this type of affluence with the tech giants of Silicon Valley and what Varoufakis terms are the cloudalists. But I think, here we should also point to something that doesn't really get talked about a lot, and which certainly fits in this category, and that's high frequency or algorithmic traders. Both groups of cloudalists were opportunistic in that they emerged during the lost decades after both the dot-com crash in 2000, 2001 and the 2007-8 global financial crisis, when capital was flowing out of institutions like hedge funds and banks and into new companies and growth sectors catalyzed by developments in technology. And these include things like high-speed internet connections and the advent of electronic trading on the stock markets. Both of these phenomena astrologers put down to the ingress of Jupiter into air sign Gemini in late May 2000, together with the mutual reception between Uranus and Neptune in 2006 or so. So for those who don't know what a mutual reception is, it's essentially when two planets are in signs that the other planet either rules or is sort of exalted in, or feels more comfortable in. So Uranus at that time was in Pisces and Neptune was in Aquarius. So you can see that they were in the sign of the other planet's domicile. So it's no coincidence that both these industries were seen as disruptors, a factor we often attribute to the planet Uranus. However, as I discussed in episode 1 of this podcast series, Neptune and Aquarius also had a role to play in enhancing the seductive appeal of these particular types of companies, while also making them very hard to regulate. Interestingly, Skinner sees a connection between Neptune and Uranus when it comes to tech companies and the internet, writing that in many ways the internet is similar to Neptune in that it is borderless and hard to contain or regulate or indeed quantify, which may be why we see these types of assets thrive under conditions where there's weak regulation, plenty of legal loopholes to exploit, and sort of like a bit of a laissez-faire sort of attitude to the market as we get to the Saturn-Neptune conjunctions in August and in February next year. Conjunctions, I think it's fair to say, are considered neutral and so tend to go either way. But in theory, this could work in a positive way, resulting in a constructive combination, for example, of realism and limits. So maybe some regulation of the tech giants that allows for less monopolies and sort of like more competition and that kind of thing. And I think the other thing I also need to sort of point out at this point is that the 2000 cycle was in many ways somewhat singular in that most astrologers would agree that the period between 2000 and 2011 was a time of major instability, both socioeconomically and politically. Some astrologers have even compared it to the volatility that the world experienced between 1968 and 1972, when you had this kind of avalanche of events like the Vietnam War, the assassination of RFK Sr., the assassination of Martin Luther King, the terrorist attack at the Munich Olympics, Watergate, etc., etc. So in a way similar to where we are now, as we're sort of reaching the Saturn and Jupiter squares. So at the time, mundane astrologers attributed this to two things. Firstly, the fact that Jupiter and then later Saturn made a series of tense aspects to the galactic center as they moved through the mutable signs of Gemini, Virgo, and Sagittarius. Now, the galactic center is essentially like it's the center of our particular galaxy and is, I think, in the late degrees of Sagittarius. So any planets that then move through other mutable signs will make squares or oppositions to that position. And the second thing is that during this decade-long stretch, the astrological picture was also complicated by the overlapping cycles of many of the outer planets, which led to a spate of challenging aspect patterns like mutable T-squares, which happened a lot in 2006, 2007, and then cardinal grand crosses and cardinal T-squares, which happened between 2009 and 2011. So, for example, in 2000, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Taurus was muddied by squares from both Neptune in Aquarius and Uranus in Pisces, which created a set of tense square aspects to both planets as they moved through Taurus and then Gemini during the early part of the decade. And then later, during the period between 2008 and 2011, the situation was worsened by a combination of Pluto's ingress into Capricorn in November 2008, which many believe caused the banking crisis, together with the Jupiter-Saturn oppositions that happened between May 2010 and March 2011, and then the Uranus-Pluto squares of 2009 to 2010, which killed off the subprime subprime mortgage market, created the banking crisis, and led to a lot of job market uncertainty, government austerity programs, civil unrest, and of course the euro crisis. So in that sense, we also have to bear that in mind, that it may be why we kind of come out of the COVID period the first time around, which was very jarring for most people, which, as I say, was associated with the Saturn-Pluto cycle, which interestingly, if you kind of go back to the previous iterations, coincided with the Spanish flu kind of after the First World War. So there's different kind of correlations with that. But I think for our purposes, what we really need to look at in terms of trying to see direct parallels between then and this cycle is looking at what happened around the two sets of waxing and waning squares, which happened between Jupiter and Saturn in 2005 to 6, and then again in 2015, 2016. So the first set of squares, when Jupiter and Saturn reached their quarter moon position, took place in December 2005, June 2006, and then late October 2006. These interestingly coincided with the rise of high-frequency trading firms, which from about 2007 to 2014 created havoc on Wall Street due to their dubious and disruptive practices, something that Michael Lewis outlines in his book Flashboys. In general, it's fair to say that, as I mentioned earlier, squares are challenging aspects. So aside from tests of faith, they also tend to or require adjustments in expectations, so as to avoid being overly optimistic or enthusiastic and therefore take unnecessary risks, as well as the need to walk the tightrope between the urge to grow and the need to set limits, or in this case, introduce regulation. So here, the adjustment may have been the shift towards electronic and algorithmic trading. And this, of course, came about because of technological developments, which, I think has to do with Uranus and Neptune, as well as Saturn and Jupiter moving through some of the sort of technological signs, like, as I say, Gemini, which is associated with telecommunications. And that's when you really saw developments starting to happen as far as things like mobile phones, broadband, etc. That was the start of it. So as well as the introduction of high-speed connections being piped directly into exchanges, and as I say, things like algorithmic trading, this meant that both retail investors and larger investment firms had to change their approach to trading in order to avoid being ripped off or getting bad deals when buying or selling stocks due to these outlier firms who were essentially front-running the market and causing a lot of share price volatility, as well as the occasional flash crash like the one that happened on the 6th of May 2010, which saw the Dow Jones Industrial Average lose over 1,000 points in minutes due to algo trading. So in response, the Securities and Exchange Commission implemented a new rule known as the flash crash rule. But as you'll find out if you read Lewis's book, like, this took a long time, and the intervention by some altruistic traders and bankers who set up their own exchange and sort of like highlighted the problem before before anything was really done. But since then, high frequency trading remains controversial, but has definitely become less of an issue now that a number of legal loopholes have been closed and deterrents like circuit breakers and trading fees have been introduced onto exchanges. Still, they do remain a problem in less regulated markets like crypto, where many believe that high-frequency trading or algo trading errors were responsible for several of the flash crashes in the crypto markets that happened in 2021. So from an astrology perspective, it seems likely that the reason HFT firms were able to operate on the fringes of the law and make so much money was down to a lack of guardrails and transparency within the system. And this was a situation amplified by the Saturn-Neptune oppositions of 2006-2007, which made trading conditions murky and rules lax, to say the least. Something that we should definitely bear in mind right now, as I say, given the impending Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, which offer an opportunity to do things like regulate crypto trading and stabilize market conditions through a mixture of prudent rules and sensible macroeconomic policy decisions, particularly from governments and central banks like the US Treasury. So hopefully, we'll see these kind of like on again, off again tariff policies becoming a thing of the past. That certainly, I think, would be helpful. Now, the same set of factors were in play in 2015-2016 when the second set of squares hit, this time coinciding with the Saturn-Neptune squares that helped enable the reality-bending trend of post-truth politics to flourish, resulting in Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, and so on, both of which had economic implications, including tax cuts for the rich, etc. And, in the years that followed, some of these policies had the effect of kind of sneakily driving up inflation and sovereign debt, particularly after the austerity years, so kind of post-2010. And in effect, as Pluto moved through Capricorn, and I think it only left sort of 2022, 2023, accelerated economic inequalities for the 99% via things like deflated pensions, lost homes after mortgage defaults, as well as increased student debt, fewer job opportunities, and difficulties getting on the property ladder. All of which had a knock-on effect on young people in particular, many of whom were really struggling to get their foot onto the property ladder or get ahead career-wise, just ask any millennial. And it was this lack of social mobility, which in turn helped foment the discontent that I think eventually spilled out into the open via subcultures like incels. And of course, that brings us back to where we kind of started. I think it also fair to say that this lack of clarity and poor appetite for regulation benefited the cloudalists, who not only launched many of their IPs during this period, so between 2010 and 2020, but also gradually swallowed up the competitors, turning them into monolithic juggernauts and seeing them command huge amounts of wealth and political power that many compare or say is on a par with small countries. So that kind of brings us back to the current cycle and the upcoming Jupiter-Saturn square, which is the last in the current series. So what could lie ahead, given market volatility we've been experiencing since February, and particularly, as I say, since the switch of Neptune into Aries and that eclipse, as well as the economic uncertainty created by Donald Trump's trade war? Well, interestingly, Jupiter has now returned to the sign of Gemini, where it's been since May 2004, during which time we have seen crypto briefly re-enter a bull market, particularly in the months following the election of Donald Trump, who also happens to be a sun sign Gemini. However, Trump's tariff policies seem to have popped that bubble for now, due to his erratic decision-making and disruptive nature, which I think, we can probably put down to a number of things, but certainly, his Saturn-Uranus conjunction was one of the factors that makes him so unpredictable. But that aside, it is interesting that Gemini is an Aries sign, and so resonates positively with the Aquarius energy of the current Jupiter-Saturn cycle. And so that, I think, in the long term should be a good thing. And it also makes me wonder what would have happened if, for example, Trump had just introduced a favorable crypto environment and not introduced the inflationary tariffs, like whether the crypto market would be doing all right now or not. And I guess, we don't know the answer to that question at this point. But at any rate, Jupiter is on the plus side due to switch signs on the 9th of June 2025, when it will ingress into the sign of Cancer, which is where it is exalted. Now, this could spell good news for the property and real estate markets, as well as sectors like hospitality, DIY home improvements, as well as any products or services related to things like food and things like mom and babies, childcare, that kind of thing. However, on the downside, this means that Jupiter and Saturn will form a cardinal square to each other in June. And that's, many of us remember, if we think back to 2009 and 2010, how charged those cardinal T-squares and grand crosses were. And that's because cardinal squares generally result in some fairly dramatic actions, decisions, and sort of events in the outer world because of their strong take charge nature. These are the signs associated with the equinoxes. The equinoxes and the solstices. So these are really the turning points of the year. So they tend to sort of create marked changes in the seasons, and so the thinking is that they do the same thing in the sort of like the world when we have transits. That's kind of the theory behind it. So looking to the chart of this particular event, one of the things that really jumps out is Neptune's proximity to Saturn in the early degrees of Aries at the time of the Jupiter-Saturn square. So this could have the effect of either softening the potential severity of any downsides, like, say, budget cuts or price drops, or, on the other hand, muddying the waters, creating fear, doubt, and uncertainty, which, of course, is never good for market stability. Now, Neptune's involvement with Saturn could potentially point to developments related to things like supply chains, especially shipping routes because of Neptune's rule of the oceans. It could also be things like water defenses, like flood defenses, that kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see how that does actually end up manifesting. However, beyond that, I think, especially given Trump's unpredictability, it's hard to say how exactly this will play out. Let's just say that I am relieved and heartened by the fact that both China and the US are traditionally Cancer ruled regions, which will hopefully mean increased goodwill and tolerance from both parties towards each other, particularly in the 12 months following, that June square. So as Jupiter changes sign and as the Jupiter-Saturn square separates, so kind of like probably from the autumn of 2025 onwards. But in terms of Saturn's ingress into Aries, I think it's important to say in terms of economic outlook that this could prove productive for things like new entrepreneurs and startups, especially if governments are smart and offer certain sectors a range of long-term schemes or incentives like tax cuts, for example, to help stimulate, those particular sectors, or indeed offer some kind of like protection from tariffs or that kind of thing. And here, Saturn's ability to add self-discipline and perseverance, combined with Aries' self-confidence and drive, could prove to be a recipe for success, especially for anyone looking to start afresh, reskill, retrain, or branch out on their own career-wise. And of course, as horrible as wars are, there's no getting away from the fact that, growing the UK and European defense sector could be a good source of jobs and economic growth over the next few years, and as well as sort of giving us sufficiency and less dependence on America, who doesn't seem that keen on the whole NATO alliance. But I think this also depends on governments making astute procurement decisions designed to maximize value, but also ensure strategic advantage and, as I say, independence. So ensuring things like technical self-sufficiency so that they're not dependent on unreliable partners to help maintain or upgrade like weapons systems, that kind of thing. But as I say, on an individual level, this 4-year period certainly looks like a good time to strike out in new directions, or to, maybe turn a side hustle into a full-time job, that kind of thing. Because as I say, the discipline of Saturn, combined with the courage to take risks and put yourself out there, definitely has the potential to be a winning combination. But of course, a lot will come down to things like individual chart placements and general market conditions, which at this stage remain unpredictable and fairly volatile. So I hope that's been thought-provoking and inspired you to consider how to work with Saturn and Neptune in your own chart and life over the next 4 years or so. I think the key thing about Saturn is that it is one of those planets that is a malefic, but it can work positively when it's well aspected, as I say, by stabilizing and kind of manifesting. But as I say, if you've enjoyed this podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review either on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just to help us to kind of grow our audience. And till next time, happy full moon and take care.